Welcome to the Possible Futures Conference. My name is Professor Sohail Inayatullah. I'm the UNESCO Chair in Future Studies and look forward to talking to you about imagination and possible futures. Let me share my screen. This presentation is focused on imagination and the creation of possible futures. Let's begin. One of the things that futurists talk about is the changing image of the future. The argument is the image normalizes, it prepaves what is possible. Oliver Markley suggested that a new image emerges. The creative minority start to imagine a different future. Reality often lags, and this lag creates the tension between the possible future and the current present. What are some examples of this? Earlier in the 50s and 60s, smoking was normalized. So much so that more doctors smoked Camel than any other cigarette was an advertisement that was considered normal. No one saw any problem with it. As you move in the last 20 years or so, for example, in Victoria, Australia, instead of tobacco smoking, the imagination of the doctor is someone meditating, someone doing yoga, because the evidence base changed, reality changed. Doctors believe the federal government should even fund meditation. More recently, we moved towards geomedicine. It's not just if you're meditating, doing your yoga, if in fact you're doing your practices, but where you are, where you're born is a predictor of the type of future you'll have. Do you live near fast food restaurants? If you do, your chances of a stroke go up. So we're seeing the rise of spatiality in medicine, what's called geomedicine. That's the emerging image. Does the new image then in fact create reality? How does the emerging image link to possible futures? Let's go back in time and look at this. One of my favorite images is this, from the year 1906. The artists imagined visual and sound connecting. What would this lead to? They suggested portable areas would make it possible for people to receive declarations of love or their racing results by wireless telegraphy in 1906. Nikola Tesla said, well, there's more than declarations of love. There's actually the beginning of a huge brain, a global brain. What H.G. Wells said, the beginning of the global brain, being able to contact anyone we want, anywhere, anytime. So you see this vision of the future start to emerge in 2030s. Visual with audio. Of course, they still had tobacco and the usual Jetsons flying car in the background. Western Electric goes a step further and says, what would it look like if you cross a telephone with a TV set? Someone talked about the television newspaper. Can you link the two? Going back to Western Electric, this was actually moving from imagination to corporation. Engineers starting entering the game. And finally, you get in 2002 Skype, and today, of course, you have Zoom. So the imagination creates the future in this sense. If you look at Star Trek in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the technologies they imagined, wrote about, thought about, they've become real. Engineers, business people said, aha, this is interesting. What would it look like if we really had this? But it's not just material technologies, it's the imagination of our social futures. Full employment, scientific management. These were figments of a utopia writer's imagination. Parliamentary democracy, the trade union movement, women's rights. Writers imagine. Individuals get inspired. Lobbyists convince legislators to act. But now these are particular imaginations. We can also go bigger. When I was in South Africa, I remember well the quote from Nelson Mandela in 1952, saying, one day I will be the first Black president of South Africa. He imagined this. And then suddenly, of course, in 1994, it becomes true. But Mandela says, let's go a step further. Let's go a step further. It always seems impossible until it's done. It always seems impossible until it's done. So I ask you, what do you think is impossible today, but if possible, changes everything in your personal life, your organization, your country, the planet? Is it abundance of energy, abundance of wealth, abundance of love? What might it be that changes the rules? The image can create in surprising ways as well. This is an imagination of education in the year 2000. The professor downloading his books and students learning. But look what's going on there. Learning is seen as text-based. Students are passive. This continues the notion of lines, of the factory. From the factory, we get the classroom like a factory. As new technologies come in, we don't change the core. It just continues. This leads Ashish Nandi to say, today's utopias, unless resisted, becomes tomorrow's nightmares. Today's utopias, unless resisted, become tomorrow's nightmares. The task of future studies, he suggests, is to make imaginative leaps, go beyond the factory. You may or may not be right. You may be wrong, but you will learn on these imaginary trips. You'll expand your sense of who you are, and you create better human futures then. Look at this imagination. We were looking at the future of the city. If you look at what's wrong there, using your critical thinking to say, what's missing here? Well, clearly there's very few humans. It's all about the built environment. Then you ask an 11-year-old, Ashley, to imagine the same thing. What does the city look like in the future? Critically, she's in the future. She's co-designing. She's co-creating. It's not something out there. She's not an objective anthropologist looking at the natives. She's creating buildings with trees, with people linked together. A very different view, an organic, green, smart city. If we go further in the future, what does this image tell us? This is about the year 2500, 3000. It goes from dinosaurs to space. Nature is the past, space is the future. The sun is over the head of the male. The nuclear family continues. Nuclear energy continues. Our imaginations of the future are not neutral. Politics, values are embedded in them. We must deconstruct them. Here's an alternative imagination of the future. In this one, the earth is at the center. Look at it closely. There's the hands of spirit, the hands of future and past. There's technology embedded in the future. There's a rainbow of peace. It says actually we must think about future in terms of human values, culture, spirit. Technology is part of it, but not the only part. We're linked from past to future, from ancestors to future generations. So we have choices to make. Will we fragment or will we evolve? Will we fragment or will we evolve? Graham Taylor's book, Evolution's Edge, develops that in detail. We're at a bifurcation point, he suggests, as many others do. Which way will we go? We're at a bifurcation point because of three crises. Crisis number one is climate change. Crisis number two is that the nation-state system is stable in itself, but outside the nation-state system, it's unstable. The Security Council has veto power, the big five. We don't have a WHO that can help stop pandemic spreads because national leaders, some believe and some don't believe in science. We have a nation-state system that doesn't protect the planet or citizens or indigenous. And third, there's deep economic inequity between nations and within nations. So we have a triple crisis. This triple crisis is exacerbated by the mistakes elites make. Faced with a surge of labor that dampens growth, elites seek to take a larger portion of the economic gains for themselves. They take a larger portion of the pie. Facing greater competition for elite wealth and status, they tighten up the path to mobility to favor themselves and their progeny. They close the doors to inclusion. Anxious to hold on to rising fortunes, they do all they can to resist taxation. They focus on the private neoliberal capitalism, not on the public, a global peer-to-peer economics. And thus we see disaster after disaster. What can we do instead? Future Studies offers an alternative way of thinking, from not just focused on the problems, but ask what are the solutions? Not just focusing on what's weird, but on whys. Not just focus on what's possible, but even going beyond to actually create the impossible. It's also person-focused. People are depressed. There's anxiety. Future Studies helps, where do you wish to be in 2040, in 2050? It's moving from fear of the other to flow, and an economics of poverty to an ecology of abundance. To do this, we have to change our structure. We have to change behavior. It's not just imagination. As Martin Luther King said, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Malcolm X says deeper, we have to challenge the world capitalist system. Embedded in it is racism, imperialism. We have to move towards a new economics, a new politics. You may disagree with the nature of that politics, but clearly we have to change the current system. It won't survive, get us to the world we wish for, given the crisis in front of us. We also have to change our worldview, what's called our mindset. This is moving from ego to family, to attachment to our country, attachment to our race, and even attachment to humanism. The founder of Humanism, P.R. Sarkar, says you have to move towards humanity plus nature. And I think he would agree as we're moving towards more mind and tech. It's a world where humans, nature, and technology co-evolve. For that, we have to have ethical frameworks, inclusive frameworks. Otherwise, the algorithms favor one group over another group. It's not deep inclusion. So this at the bottom is about the story. We have to change the story. Sarkar suggests moving from a society based on only the ego to a society of people walking together. If there's a problem with one group, they stop and they help. They stay focused on progress, where they wish to go, but they help others. So this is a quite different way of seeing the future. In work we've done on not the futures, but a possible future, we suggested we need to move from ego leadership to balanced leadership, from me and mine to the shared journey, from linear macrohistory only focused on the progress of a few to spiral macrohistory, progress plus inclusion, from GDP to the quintuple bottom line, prosperity, people, planet, purpose, and partnership, from an international system that's unstable to global governance, from patriarchy to gender cooperation, from humans over nature to partnership with nature, from religiosism to new humanism, from meat-based to plant-based, from tech and algorithms for the few to technology for all, from individualism to social equity, and from materialism to spirituality, feeling the presence of the transcendental in everything we do, to having purpose, nation states to regionalism and confederations. And finally, from tracking hours worked to actually time spent on purpose. And far less inequity, far more maxi-mini equity. So this is a major shift on the possibility of who we are, who we can become. Now you may disagree with these, but the most important thing is start to imagine the future of yourself and the planet. Where do you wish to go? Which way will we go? Is it the story of me, myself, and my tribe? Social Darwinism? Survival of the fittest? Institutions of privilege? Who wins the race? Or is it something else? Equity. All win, but in different ways. The quintuple bottom line of prosperity, planet, people, purpose, and partnership. Shifting to new humanism, changing the story from me, myself, and my tribe to the pilgrimage. But who are you in the story? Who are you? It's not just them changing. Who will I? What will I do? Am I the brain in the computer? Is it all mine? Am I burdened by life's journey? Am I afraid of climate change, the end of the world? Am I militaristic? Or am I the catalyst who works together? Am I reflective? With the Age Business Futures Network, we have this as our image. The tree, exploring, studying, partnering. You may ask yourself, are you Pollyanna or Cassandra, the gardener, the catalyst, or are you the depressed one, the world, the end of the world is near? Figure out what is your story and what's your contribution to the changing world. As part of this is imagining where you wish to be. The tennis player Djokovic, when he was small, imagined himself winning Wimbledon. After injuries, he was worried he would not win again. So he didn't focus on the winning, he focused on his child coming to him in the stands and hugging him. So this is feeling yourself in the future. Of course, we study drivers and trends, quantitative changes in labor markets. We also focus on how we wish to feel in the future. What's the emotions we wish to carry with us and share? The takeaway is those that imagined an activity were far more likely to accomplish it. Work from Spreng and Levine. Those that imagined an activity were far more likely to accomplish it. This imagination is based on stories, on metaphors we tell ourselves. These metaphors work until there's a crisis, then we need a new narrative. One CEO said he has excellence. His story was like the tennis game. Life and work are like a tennis game. but he saw himself, he was good at the grass court. Today in meetings, he no longer knows the right language. What do you say to others? How do you treat others? How do you react to technological shifts? So his new story was a man who could play on multiple courts. In the long term, he said, actually, he became a CEO for the rally, the fun of the game, the connection, the community, not just to win. His new story was becoming the coach, the next horizon. One young detective, he took one of my courses, and I remember this story well. He was in a room full of other detectives who were much older. He felt he was on top of new technologies, on type of cyber protection. The other detectives were still doing things the old way. His metaphor was an iPhone in a room full of Nokias, an iPhone in a room full of Nokias. He started to change the story to the co-created shipmaker, the co-created shipmaker. Downstream, prevention. But over time, he realized that actually the most important thing was how he felt about the future, and he imagined himself as the warm, loving sun, connecting with people. So it was emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, as important as new cyber skills. So this becomes the way forward to the future. Imagine the impossible. Vision yourself in that impossible future. Develop strategies to create that. Find metaphors, stories that help you there. If your story does not work, create a different story and find strategic solutions, change the system, change the rules, the paradigm in which we live in, change what we see as normal and create the new future. Have a wonderful journey. Thanks so much for spending this time with me. I hope you have a wonderful conference. Goodbye.
Gente, foi maravilhoso a gente ver essa explanação geral do Sohail. E agora ele gravou para a gente também um vídeo com um apanhadão das respostas para as principais perguntas que vocês enviaram nas últimas semanas. Vamos ver esse vídeo agora.
Thanks so much for your wonderful questions. Let me try to address them generally and then specifically. I think the first point is really imagination means leading from where we wish to be, the preferred future, not the future we may have been given. It may be a used future, a future we don't wish for. So imagination is desiring the future, being able to visualize it, to really get some details on it. I know with my colleague Wishan Lam in Singapore, when he talked about how they did public policy before, it was looking for best practice. You take ministers, directors around the world, and you say, here's our examples of what works. Now that worked until they became number one in infrastructure and transport. Then he said, actually, you have to imagine the future. Believing is seeing is the old world. Now he said, seeing is believing. So the imagination guides you into where you wish to go. However, our imagination is always contoured by visions of the future. So we don't imagine acontextually, we imagine with data, information, images, movies, scientific text that we have. It's not a tabula rasa. Imagination exists in a context. So thus, in that sense, reimagining, it says, here's the imagination we've been given. The world we live today is the imagination of a certain philosopher, a certain teacher, certain institutional practices. Reimagining means changing some of those institutional practices, rethinking our worldview, our commitments, our admiration of certain ways of thinking, and imagining something else. So that's reimagination. Memory here can be positive and can be negative. Memory can be positive, and we say, well, let's not forget World War II, for example, the implications of racism. But memory, if you've been traumatized, doesn't help you imagine a different future. So some of the best foresight projects we have are with countries and organizations that don't have long histories. They are more free to imagine the future we want, they wish for. One chapter book I wrote about tied to the past and chained to the future. In that sense, the future was already given by the nation-state-centric view of the past. So thus our imaginations, when we think of the world system, still assumes the international state system will continue. We're unable to imagine other possibilities of the structure. For example, the United Nations, we assume what's future of the United Nations, we still assume the nation-state system are its representatives. But a reimagining says, well, who else can be part of it? Citizens, people, nature, businesses. So reimagination says, let's not focus on the past, let's focus on what's possible. So in this sense, imagination can be used to create a better future, can be used to create an alternative future. And this is, of course, the issue of inclusion. We ran a conference on disability in the future in Queensland, and the minister was brilliant. And he made sure there were 550 or so people there, persons with disability and service providers. So we start the process, everyone told their story. But I think the most powerful one was someone who was blind, and she says she doesn't want to be known as just blind. She wants to be known as just Julie, the person who lives on the 3rd floor. So this is her imagination moving from being described in a certain way to being described in a way that was just her. So imagination then, what is the future we wish to see? Now in this meeting, we also use CLA, causal analysis. So let's structure the imagination. So level 1 was the data. So this would be the type of infrastructure available for persons with disability. Indeed, for them, it was having a world where you don't even need to have the category of disability. Everyone is differently abled. Level 2, the city should be designed like a Paralympics. Everything is accessible. Level 3, a worldview going away from ableism to a worldview of diversity of ability. And finally, the metaphor was Julie, the blind girl on the 3rd floor, to just Julie. So imagination needs to be contoured, needs to have structure. So we use causal analysis, which has 4 levels: the data, the system, the worldview, and the metaphor. Now, certainly imagination is different in different countries. We were working recently with Mongolia, with WHO, and we did the inner work. What's your preferred future of yourself? The imagination comes from their history. So one person said she lived on the steppes where time was about before lunch, after lunch. It wasn't Western clock time. But now that she's working in a hospital, she said she had to reimagine herself. So she used the worldview of clock time, 9 to 6, 9 to 9 temporality, and said, aha, she used to be the step girl, and now she has to become a city girl. So her imagination was both helped by her past and hindered by her past. And this sense for her Mongolian history, living in nature in the steppes was both an asset, and in this case became a deficit because of the work she needed to do. So when we think about imagination, we think about metaphors, stories people use. Those are accessible, and those are always based on a people's historical narrative. And that changes based on who you are, where you are. Again, with one person, she described herself as the head of a hospital. She said she was like a golden fish, the golden fish, meaning everyone looked at her and she made everyone happy. Now that worked, but we said, wow, what's a better imagination, a better story, a way that makes her life more fulfilled? And she went with, aha, it's actually the bamboo. Bamboo is far more flexible. Bamboo, the anger, the structure, the problems can go right through, and she can stay as far more flexible and meet the needs of people in the hospital. Now, what's critical part here is the inclusion. It was about her and the needs of everyone else. So this is one of the key principles of futures thinking. Who's not in the room? So if you're doing a foresight process for a country, a workshop, or organization, you have to understand who are the different stakeholders and what are their stories and how do you meet their needs. With one large bank I'm working with, the managing director said, aha, for the next meeting, when she does the visioning, reimagining the bank, she has to understand the perspectives of the different actors. Many of the actors are quantitative experts. If she says, let's imagine the future, they'll say, what a waste of time. I didn't come here to imagine the future. Here's the data about how banking is being challenged by peer-to-peer economics, how it's being challenged by tech, how the core of banking is actually losing its core, getting hollowed out. So they would want data about the future. But other people are more personal. They want to connect with the other bankers. They know banking is about relationship. And the third force said, no, disruption is so strong, we have to reimagine the future. So with each group, she had to ensure they were included, and she had to ensure she had a strategy for each one. And of course, as you're thinking about this, you also want to maybe asking, well, who else should be in the room? Certainly, it can't be just the bankers. It has to be customers. And clearly today, in an environment where banking is under security threat, you would need security experts. And if you were really doing this well, you would say, well, let's ask the imagination of people who seek to break into our security network. So this is now far more inclusive. We need to understand their views, the ones who seek to do crime. What's their imagined future? What's the world they wish to live in? One example I gave in the talk was when they asked the future of one particular city, they asked architects and experts, and they had the usual thing. They had the Jetsons, flying cars. So our imagination is so much informed by one particular culture's media representations of technology in the air, and that goes from flying cars to drones to portable lift packs. Now then they asked someone else, they asked an 11-year-old girl the same question, what's her imagined future? It was far more textured, green, nature, with technology, with individualized transportation, with a whole range of high-tech transportation. So you had a diversity of transportation, a diversity of mobility. And the critical part of imagination, it wasn't just she was imagining their future. She was in the imagination. So when we think about imagination, we have to make sure we're in that story. And this is the critical part, seeing futures as not just about them, but a learning journey where we're part of it. So level one is often, let's find the data and convince the decision maker. Decision makers are often informed by worldviews, and data doesn't challenge their worldview. How can we see in the war, the Russian aggression in Ukraine? More data to Putin doesn't change it. All he wants from the data, let's just do it, let's just keep with the strategy, that's often journey two, let's just do it. Now in our world, the acceleration of change and the changing nature of change and heterogeneous nature of change means we can't just do it. We have to do something called double loop learning, learning about learning. What are we missing? What are our assumptions? Mistakes in strategy occur generally from mistaken assumptions. So we ask ourselves, what are our assumptions about the future? Is it more Jetsons? Is it Gaia? Is nature more important? Who needs to be in the imagination? And finally, the critical part is the narrative, the storytelling around the imagination. Once you can go there, then there's a huge potential for transformation. You're not just focused on the future, it's alternative futures. You're not just focused on doing the future to them, you're co-creating, you're co-designing. It's a shared collective imagination. Now we know for the short term, electoral leaders, prime ministers, ministers, they use fear of the other to gain voting. In the long term, we know inclusive imagination that brings in greater voices, the system becomes far more robust. It can withstand threats and attacks on it because everyone is bought into the possible future. You see that with sports. Once they have a shared metaphor of their sports team, once they have a shared worldview of, say, passing, learning from each other, then they do far better. So seeing this as imagination is critical in futures thinking, in future studies. So part one is, what's the imagination we've been given? Do we support that imagination? If we don't, what's a better imagination? This is a visualization. This is asking ourselves, what today is impossible, but if possible, changes everything. It disrupts, it realigns our focus from past we don't wish to futures we want. So imagination moves from past we don't wish to futures we want. To do this better, you have to do alternative futures so you can see the full array of futures. To do this better, you have to look at inclusion. Who's included, who's not included. To do this better, you have to be able to visualize it. And you have to find text. You have to show the imagination so people can be informed by different possible futures, not just by the given future. Thanks so much. Hope you have a fantastic conference. Great working with you. Thank you.